my son first became an offset press operator, he came home one evening with a quiz look. He told me he was printing an 80-pound text and an 80-pound cover. And while they were both 80-pound, one was so much heavier than the other. "How's that possible?" he asked, "as both weights are the same?" Well, he's not the only one who has asked me this very question over the years. Well, I have a fun theory on that. Hi, I'm Jim Kohlers, Sylvamo's paper professor, with a fun but slightly fractured historic paper episode. Stick with me. You know, we in the United States still use the English measurement system, which we of course inherited from the British so very long ago. Now, if you think about paper making back in the 17 or 1600s, for example, there were no large paper companies producing paper. Paper was being produced in small shops, many who specialized in a grade or a type of paper they produced. At that time, paper was made by hand, one at a time. Fiber came many times from the haberdashery shops or cuttings from clothes being made. Of course, all clothes were made from cotton back then, so that was the fiber of choice. No synthetic fibers back then, and of course, this is way before paper made from wood came about. Well, the way I figured it, these different basis weights came about is because paper makers were beginning to make different grades for different end uses. You know, you might have a customer, for example, needing 8.5 by 11 sheets. So the paper maker decides they would make a frame, a large frame, measuring 17 by 22 inches. So now they can make 4 sheets of 8.5 by 11, increasing their production. They are paper makers. So the paper maker makes a weight of pulp and produces 1 sheet of paper measuring 17 by 22 inches, which they then cut into 4 8.5 by 11 sheets. They figure they have to somehow come up with a measuring classification system and a name. So they decided to make 499 more sheets, each measuring 17 by 22 inches, which gave them great production. After they had made 500 sheets, again each measuring 17 by 22 inches, they placed it on a pile, on a scale, and it weighed 20 pounds. Since the grade they were making was used mostly for writing, they called it 20-pound bond. So far, so good. As it turned out, some of their customers needed a heavier weight paper, so they made a heavier pulp and did the same thing. They made 500 sheets, each measuring 17 by 22 inches. When they placed the heavier paper on the scale, lo and behold, it weighed 24 pounds. They called this 24-pound bond. And so it goes. Now, they had another customer who needed paper to print books. The page in the book was of a different size than the bond paper, so this required a different frame size. They figured a frame size of 23 by 35. That would be the best to make paper for books. Plus, they needed to make a higher quantity of paper. They decided to use the same system they used for the bond, so they made 500 sheets of paper from the same pulp weight as they did to make the 20-pound bond. They took the 500 sheets and weighed them. Turns out the 500 sheets weighed, you guessed it, 50 pounds. Since they were making book paper, they called it 50-pound book. They really couldn't call it offset since it wasn't around yet. They then made some heavier pulp, same as when making the 24-pound bulb. They produced 500 sheets and again weighed them. Lo and behold, the 500 sheets weighed, you guessed it, 60 pounds. They then called that grade 60-pound book. And so it goes. They then had to make some cover stock for the books, of course. Since the cover must be larger in sheet size than the bond or the book paper, a different frame size was needed. So they figured out a frame size of 20 by 26 inches was selected. They also knew they would need a heavier pulp since the cover had to be more resilient. They made a very heavy pulp, and following what they did to produce the bond or the book paper, made 500 sheets, each measuring 20 by 26 inches, and weighed it. Guess what? The 500 sheets weighed 80 pounds. They called this grade 80-pound cover. They did the same as they did with the other grades, and even made a heavier pulp, again making 500 sheets and weighing it. It turned out to weigh, you guessed it, 100 pounds. They then called that a 100-pound cover. The same continued for other grades. Each grade, due to its various size, required a different frame size to properly produce a quantity of sheets. As the paper requirements grew through the years, the paper makers kept producing different frame sizes, but measuring in the same fashion, measuring 500 sheets of a frame size to arrive at a paperweight. And so it goes. So now, since we are still in that English measuring system, these sizes have never changed through the years. So what we are left with is a lot of different basis weights due to the different frame sizes. So for my son, his 80-pound text, which can be used for books, uses the book frame size of 23 by 35. Measuring 500 sheets resulted in a weight of 80 pounds. On the other hand, the 80-pound cover was made with a frame size of 20 by 26, which with a heavier pulp, measured with the 500 sheets again, weighed 80 pounds. Of course, the rest of the globe is on the metric system, and because of that, they do not have this issue as paperweight is measured in grams per meter squared. So simple. Most, if not all, digital papers today will show the English and metric weights on the package. In the future, I certainly hope we will finally switch over to the metric system and be done with all this confusion. Today, many cartons, skids, etc. may be labeled with both the old basis weight labels along with the metric. And so it goes. Well, if we used the metric system, the 80-pound text would have been 118 grams per meter squared, and the 80-pound cover 216 grams per meter squared. 118 text and 216 cover, that sure would have been a lot easier to tell the difference. Well, I think you have to admit, my theory is a pretty good one, but who really knows? Maybe in the future we will catch up with the rest of the world, as we are about the only country not on metric. For Sylvamo Papers, I'm Jim Kohler, the paper professor, and thanks for joining me at my editing studio instead of on the road for this fun fractured episode, and I sure hope to see you in another Paper Professor episode.